Eli Ravel Wilson, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you as well, Gwyneth. It's an honor to be here in the studio.
So, in your book, Front of the House, Back of the House, you say restaurants are places of social segregation. They are inequality regimes. How do restaurants breed inequality?
I know, and I'm glad we're starting there, Gwyneth, because I think a lot of people who go out to eat, restaurants are a tremendous source of pleasure. They're places of entertainment, of leisure, and all of these kind of feel-good, wonderful reasons why we patronize restaurants. My job, though, as a sociologist, in particular, a type of sociologist known as an ethnographer, is to go in deeper, go behind the scenes, and really examine and be critical in doing so, in thinking about what are we seeing going on? When you look underneath the hood, so to speak, of restaurants, you sort of literally and figuratively entering into the back of house spaces that are far less visible to customers. So in my book, really what I'm exploring is it's immediately evident to anyone who works in restaurants or is able to step foot in those behind the scenes spaces that, as I like to say, people who look different, sound different, have different social attributes, work in very different capacities in restaurants, particularly on the higher end of the spectrum. So in other words, not fast food, but your typical maybe sit-down restaurant, maybe like a Friday night date spot, so to speak, those types of environments. And so I was interested in exploring, why do we see these tremendous divides, these divides of race and of social class, and also of gender and other types of social statuses. And that became sort of the puzzle, that became the source of driving my investigation.
So, what do these divides look at in terms of race and class? Who is where, for those of us who are not paying attention?
Excellent. Yeah. So to be very brief about this, in the front of the house, that is the spaces, the public spaces of restaurants, hosts, servers, bartenders. These tend to be individuals who are lighter in skin, oftentimes racially white. They are younger. They tend to be both men and women, but sometimes predominantly female. And in these settings, they also tend to be settings where those individuals tend to have greater levels of education as well. And we'll get into in just a little bit why that is the case. Now, in the back of the house, you see people with, again, very different social attributes. These tend to be in a place like New Mexico or in Los Angeles, which was home base for my study. These tend to be individuals that are predominantly foreign-born, or maybe the children of foreign-born immigrants. And they tend to be disproportionately Latinx. In this case, primarily Latino men. So again, very different patterns that we see behind the scenes in terms of who does what type of job within restaurants and other types of service environments as well. It's not just restaurants.
Yeah, so service is the key here. We're not talking about mom and pop places where there's really no distinction between the people making the taco and passing the taco across the counter. It's the tipping system that defines this inequality. Is that it?
In large part. So just to clarify what you said, which I think is spot on, the kind of environments that I was looking at are not, as you say, mom and pop restaurants. I would also go as far as to say kind of casual or fast food environments. These are settings where there's actually been a lot of literature, both by journalists and academics, looking at these settings as low-wage labor settings, places where they have been widely criticized as kind of exploitative of workers in terms of labor hours and precarious work conditions, as well as low wages. So that's one very important aspect of the restaurant industry. And I can, of course, say a little bit more about that. But what I was interested in was settings in which hospitality, that sort of service you receive from workers, different kinds of workers too, where hospitality, it plays a central role in what it means to labor in that environment. And those are settings where tipping becomes a key dimension of both the kind of money that workers make, but also it gets fused into all kinds of different relationships that go on behind the scenes, not just between tipping customers and the workers that receive that earning, but also what happens after that, right? So where do the tips go? Who do they flow to? Who do they not flow to? In what quantity? What role does management play? There's a whole set of really important questions behind the scenes, sort of after the diner has already left, that marking on a credit card slip or left some dollars and maybe cents on top of the bill.
I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who own restaurants or have owned restaurants or worked in them who are just horrified by the idea that they are part of this institution that enforces a racist, unequal system. Is this an intentional thing, or are people aware of it, people in management?
That's a great question. And, I think that there's a simple answer and probably a more complicated one. I'm going to take the latter route here since, we're dealing with, I think, an educated, informed audience here today. So the more complicated answer is it's really some of both. I think in many ways, as I put it in my book, what we're dealing with here is business as usual forms of social inequality. And what I mean by that is social inequality that is not the product of overtly racist or sexist or sort of evil actors. To me, that story, although still maybe present in pockets, every now and then we have some expose story that comes out. I think you and I have both heard something of that nature. But that was less of interest to me. Frankly, many of the managers and supervisors that I interacted with over the course of doing my field work were wonderful, loving, caring human beings that wanted the best for not just themselves, but for their staff and, of course, for their guests. So that was not the case. That was not what was the primary sort of point of interest for me. I was far more interested in this phenomena that in sociology has become a tremendously fruitful line of research, which is the way in which social inequalities get reproduced without any of us knowing, with all of us just kind of going about our daily business in the way that we best see fit. And that becomes a far more interesting and, I would say, insidious way that today, here in 2021, we see these social inequalities get reproduced.
That is super interesting. So, if people want to change this sort of system that they're a part of without even really realizing, what do they need to do? Is it like just get rid of the tipping system, everybody gets a living wage and call it good?
Wouldn't it be so easy? Well, let me back up a half step before fully answering that question, which is to kind of unpack a little bit about what I found, my argument as to how indeed social inequality gets reproduced within restaurants. And I argue in my book, based on extensive field research, that it's both the product of distinct managerial choices about hiring, choices about supervisory practices, that again are not so overtly sexist or racist, but are looking for certain qualities in a worker, say, in the front of the house versus those in the back of house. And as a function of screening people that come in for a job application, in these subtle ways. For instance, most prominently in the front of house, managers looking for individuals who carry themselves well, right? A manager may say something like, that person sounds good, or just feels like they would be a good fit in this kind of upscale setting of hospitality, or my customers are really going to enjoy talking to that person. Now, we can sort of think about a little bit of what's being coded, what kind of attributes are being coded in when we get that kind of comment. In my view, it's a little bit about race, those who are lighter skinned, maybe quote unquote present better. It's also a class component, right? Speaking well, right? Articulating words, using certain word choices. Imagine describing a filet mignon.
They speak well because they're grad students, right?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So, all of these subtle ways in which the way we look, the way we sound becomes are not directly, the management does not understand them as codes for race. But maybe more subtly, if they really examine who best fits that type of role, we see these screens of race and class and also of gender here playing out and sorting people into these unequal types of jobs. So that's management's role. I would also add briefly that I argue in my book, it's not just management that enacts the social inequality. Coworkers play a very key role here. what I argue in my book in very subtle ways is that as a function of people with different social attributes being screened into these structurally different jobs within restaurants. Imagine working deep in the kitchen, washing dishes in a hot environment, noisy environment, or working up in the dining room amongst colleagues who maybe as a function of what I just said, sort of look like you and sound like you. You kind of have similar sort of interests. As a function of that, workers themselves start to understand themselves as different from one another. They start enacting social and symbolic boundaries against one another, as in, this is who, quote unquote, we are, say, as servers and bartenders. Here's how we act. This is why we deserve these jobs. And this is who they are. I'm pointing over there, and over there, of course, would be in the kitchen. Latino immigrants maybe speaking in Spanish, obviously maybe looking differently, at least the way that workers themselves understand these differences. And so workers enact their own kind of boundaries that make it very difficult for, say, a Latino or Latina immigrant to make the crossover and work in a highly tipped bartending role, customer-facing bartender role. So workers play a role there too, as well as customers, which I can go into later. So all of that is go ahead.
Are you saying that managers need to be aware of this and change their hiring practices? How does that look? I mean, all of a sudden you want them to hire people who don't look like them, don't feel like them? I mean, is that it?
No, that's a really great observation. So once again, going back to what I said earlier, managers are just doing what makes sense to them. Of course, we need to understand that there are sometimes problematic implications of the way management uses some of these screening devices. Excuse me. But to get at your point, what can management do? I am a big advocate going to more practical steps of sort of what can we do about all this. I'm a big advocate of creating job ladders for employees, breaking down what is previously understood as just that person either has it or they don't. They either are friendly or customers like them or they don't. Breaking that down into specific skills, training, and providing resources for workers to gain those skills. And ultimately, if they do gain those skills, allowing them to move up in the hierarchy, allowing them more positions of responsibility. In other words, again, breaking down some of these socially coded differences and hierarchies within restaurants and actually creating bridges into better quality jobs.
Look, restaurants have had a hard time during the pandemic. A lot of them went completely broke, had to close. This sounds like a lot of work. What's in it for restaurants to actively make all these changes?
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful point. This has been an absolutely brutal year. I've written on this. I've talked to some of my old colleagues in restaurants, and everyone was suffering, both management, workers, everyone involved, as I'm sure you're well aware. So this question of like, well, isn't this just too much work? Can restaurant owners as well as managers, can they really do anything about this? So the way I like to kind of reframe that amidst tremendous challenge, which is maybe the pandemic, maybe a topic for another time. But the key here is what I advocate is the more restaurants can seek to empower workers is actually good business for them as well, right? The more you reduce turnover, for instance, the more you empower workers to take ownership over being there rather than seeing this as a part-time job while you're really trying to do something else. This is that kind of liminal relationship with workers themselves, not really seeing their identity, their work identity, as a restaurant worker, as a restaurant professional. The more you can actually empower workers to take that on is ultimately good business. It's good. It builds customer relations. It can do a number of things that are really productive. I would also add one more thing, which is that we're also in a time that, in my mind, there's sort of dual prongs going on right now. One, of course, being the pandemic affecting the industry. The second is the rise of these social movements, such as Black Lives Matter, or the Me Too movement that was a few years back and is still ongoing today. What we're seeing here is that more of the American population is taking interest in these social movements, and I believe that they are wanting to see a bit more of that messaging coming from what they consume, right? Where they put their dollars. Would they rather spend money and spend time in establishments that are showing advocacy, true advocacy to better their communities, or for a larger, a little bit more nondescript kind of corporate entity, not made those kinds of overtures. So customers too have a very distinct option. And I would say that, again, in this context of the moment we are in related to social movements, a very powerful thing for restaurateurs to understand is the more they can get on board with that, so to speak, not in a corny way, but in a more authentic way. I think that's also good business. That's a way forward for the industry.
Eli Rebelliano Wilson, thank you so much for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.